Misha here, and over on the main channel, Mishaco, we've been doing Gun of the Day videos, and recently we announced a vacation. We've been not only putting out videos over there since January, but instead of going on vacation in April, we went the other direction and started pumping out more content because of the whole lockdown situation. So with that, I've been pretty exhausted and not had a lot of time or, frankly, energy to do personal videos. But recently, because I'd had it on order for so long, I did post a video on this critter here. This is the Junkers Ju.88A, and this is the A variant from Corgi, 1/72 scale diecast. I did a, 15-20 minute video talking about its history and the whole Schnell bomber, the whole fast bomber concept that the Nazi Germans were aiming for before and early on during World War II. And I kind of mentioned I would later talk about other German bombers. Well, I really haven't had time to construct and do a lot of research, but I felt like talking a little bit, so this is going to be kind of like a Gun of the Day video. Not really researched or anything, just chatting. So I have two others out. I have the Dornier Do.17Z, and this is a 17Z, or Z for our Canadians. And this is by far the most common variant. And I have a Heinkel He. 111. This is an H variant, which again is by far the most common. And really all three of these started off very close together and were all of the same concept to some extent. And again, these two are 1/72 scale diecast from Corgi. The Do.17 I've actually had for a couple of years. The Heinkel I just got, it just came out. Although I've had another version, the one with the doodle bug, for a couple of years too. Well, I guess for about a year because it's when it came out. But what's kind of neat, even though these kind of represent different stages in the life of these planes. For example, the 88A is an early version, whereas the Z and the H are pretty late versions. They're all from the same basic time period, late 1939 through late 1940. The Do.17 is actually a night fighter variant, which was one of this aircraft's final career choices. The Heinkel here is of a bomber/reconnaissance variant. It's actually an H2. This over here is a Z10. And the 88 is of a tactical or dive bomber variant. It could either be an A4 or an A5, although this is technically an A5. So, with that, what do we have here? And what do I feel like talking about when it comes to German tactical and strategic bombing doctrine? Let's just hang out a bit and chat about the models and go from there. Well, the first one of these to fly, although not by much, was the Dornier Do.17, which flew in November of 1934. And there's a little bit of debate, historically speaking, as to if this was always designed as a bomber or maybe a more multi-role. Obviously, after World War I, Germany was not allowed to have flying corps, essentially. But beginning around 1932, the Allies permitted them to begin designing commercial aircraft. So it's actually said that the Dornier began life as a fast freight aircraft for mail, also to be used as a fast passenger transport that could carry maybe 6 to 10 people, depending on the comfort level, ranging from not very comfortable to hellaciously uncomfortable. But the concept was to have a fast, quick little aircraft, 2 engines. And work began in 1932, at least design work, and the military became interested in 1933 after everyone's favorite Herman came to the authority. And that's when the Do.17 designation was applied. And the prototype first flew, like I said, in late 34. But then they didn't really know what to do with it. There's a few contradicting stories. But it seems like the prototypes just kind of hung out for a bit till they figured things out. And they honestly got things up and running. The Heinkel here started off around the exact same time, 1932. And it was designed to be a larger aircraft from the outset. Mr. Heinkel himself voiced his desire to make the fastest passenger airplane in the world. And then in 1933, the government got involved, and he convinced him to kind of move to a larger factory, hire more people, get into mass production. And it's worth knowing that even though the factory was named after Heinkel, it was really owned by the Nazis. Well, design work took place throughout 1933, and then the first prototype started to be built in 1934, and it flew just a little after the Do.17Z. The He.111H flew in February of 1935, and whereas there's some debate if the 17 was intended to be a bomber from the outset, the 111 always was. It's nicknamed the wolf in sheep's clothing because even though it was officially marketed in the beginning as a commercial transport, in fact, in January of 1936, it was officially declared the fastest passenger aircraft in the world, and they even produced commercial versions, the 111C and 111G most notably, and Lufthansa did operate about a dozen of these. It was always meant to be a bomber, a Schnellführer, a fast bomber. It's worth pointing out that Lufthansa did check out the Do.17, but quickly determined that it was too uncomfortable for a passenger and too expensive to operate as a mail truck. So that's one reason it kind of sat around throughout 1935, more or less collecting dust. Well, finally, and I don't want to repeat myself because I've already done a full video on this one, the Ju.88. This was produced in response to a RLM request for a Schnell bomber in 1935, originally to have 3 seats and to carry at least 1,000 pounds or 1,000 kilograms of ordnance. So it definitely was designed as a bomber, but also as a multi-role aircraft, dive bomber, tactical bomber, reconnaissance, torpedo bomber, what have you. So, yeah. And the plan was to put these into production, into service by 1938. Now, the prototype did fly towards the end of 1936, November, December, I can't remember which. But there were several delays in setting up production. This was a pretty hot rod aircraft for its day. Also, there were some design changes made in 37, meaning that really it didn't enter into full production until the end of 1939, which you might notice is already after World War II began. So, yeah. So what exactly did we have here? What are these airplanes? Well, the 17 here is definitely the most traditional and kind of older tech design. It was designed to be fast, and it was relatively fast when it was put onto paper, but in reality, really it never went much above 250 miles per hour, with some versions barely scraping over 210 miles per hour. It had a problem of getting good engines. A lot of the best engines were allocated, reserved for fighters like the Bf-109, Bf-110, and later planes like the Focke-Wulf. I knew that was going to happen. That's why I don't try to rotate these on camera so much. It's also why I end up doing these on a cloth thing. So, all's well. But yeah, so it was underpowered. They would improve things a bit, but never would get great. It's about 52 feet long, with about a 59-foot wingspan. It was nicknamed the Flying Pencil because of its thin fuselage. This had the benefit of making it a hard target, but it also had the disadvantage, along with the weaker engines than planned, for having a relatively minor bomb load of about 1,000 kilograms internal. She also had guns, of course. Originally, they really weren't thinking too much about them, because they thought, oh, this thing will be fast enough, it can just outfly enemy fighters. Well, they were quickly disabused of this when they were first tested out during the Spanish Civil War, beginning in 1937. So they started off with 3 machine guns, then they would up it in some versions to 6 and even 8 in some instances would be on board. This would also require the crew to be upped from 3 to 4 to operate the guns. It was relatively forgiving to fly, and again, relatively small. But the concept of being a fast little bomber, it was unfortunate because it was just designed at that time of rapid progress. Very few aircraft designed in the mid-30s were still modern by 1940. Nevertheless, early on, 1937, 1938, this was pretty much the frontline light bomber, but it had pretty restricted range and endurance, and originally its max altitude was only about 18,000 feet. Later versions could get closer to 20,000 feet, so on and so forth. Let's hope this one doesn't try to fall, because it's pretty unstable in its stand. I usually like Corgi stands, but something about these Heinkels is just chancy. This was designed more to be a medium bomber. She was about 54 feet long and had a wingspan of 74 feet. She too suffered early on from having weak engines, underpowered engines. Eventually they would settle on a Junkers engine that worked pretty well for it, but originally her bomb load was pretty restrictive, only about 1.5 kilograms, but later this would be upped pretty significantly to an internal load of about 2,000 kilograms, or over 3,000 external. Although if they used the external racks, they could not use the internal bays, so it was kind of a trade-off. She was faster, but Again, quickly showing her datedness. She could get up with some versions and not having a full bomb load to 290 to 295 miles per hour. But more typically, ladened up and everything, she was more in the 240 to 250 range. So faster, but not significantly so. Likewise, she had a slightly higher maximum ceiling, depending on the version, than the Do.17. But, yeah. And originally, she had a crew of 4. As her guns were increased, this would go to 5. And the machine guns would jump up to 6 and 7, 8 millimeters. Later, she would sometimes be given a 20 millimeter cannon in the nose, and sometimes a 13 millimeter machine gun in the rear ventral or dorsal places. Either she retained her 8 mil machine guns, they would go from drum fed to belt fed in a lot of instances. So trying to improve things. And there would be a lot of versions. Funnily enough, the original 111A was not accepted by the German military, but it was accepted by the Chinese. The Bs were kind of a pre-production. The Ds never got anywhere because they had their engines stolen by the BF-109. The Es would be the first ones to really go into full production and use. They would start to roll off the assembly line in early 1938, just in time to be used in the Spanish Civil War that spring. And this is where they started to realize the Schnell bomber concept maybe was a little on the flawed side, because modern interceptors were just becoming too fast and overtaking them, and they discovered that pretty much all their bombers did not have enough protections. This is when you start to see more guns or larger guns. On the other hand, she did have more fuel, better range, although still not outstanding. And she could take a beating. The 111 was relatively rugged plane for the late 30s. It's also worth pointing out that the 17 here had self-sealing fuel tanks. And so both of these pretty much made up the Luftwaffe's bomber corps getting into 1939. It's said that they had a little over 700 He.111s at the beginning of September 1939, and about 530 17s. So these were both used in Poland. And already by August of 39, this H model, the H2, which this actually is here, was starting to be produced. And there would be quite a large number of the H's. They would run from 1 through 22, maybe 24, although of course some would never be produced and others would be produced in limited numbers, but you get the idea. So this would be what was up. As for our Ju.88, as I said, they were just starting to make these production models at the beginning of the war. There was maybe a dozen in Luftwaffe service in September of 39. And it really wasn't until 1940 that they started to appear in any significant numbers. Really, their first major use was during the invasion of France and all of that. And by the time of Operation Barbarossa, invasion of Russia, June 1941, these were starting to phase out the old Do.17s. The Dorniers were on their way out. Production was essentially wrapping up. They had built a little over 2,100. And they were being pretty much taken out of frontline service. They had the small bomb load, and there was only so much they could do to protect them with the machine guns, and again, they didn't have the best armor in the world, and they were the slowest of the three, meaning they were becoming more and more of a sitting duck to new generation monoplane fighters from the Allies. They were fighting against older biplanes, but yeah, the monoplanes were kind of owning them. It was just old tech. So after 1940, these were increasingly relegated to second-line roles. They were used at the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, but really, by the end of 1941, they were even pulled out of Russia. And even then, they were half the time just used for reconnaissance, sometimes attacking tanks whenever there was no air threat. Now, this model here is from 1940, and this has it set up as a night fighter. You'll notice it has a solid nose instead of the more glass or glazed nose. Originally, they would try to do 3 8mm machine guns and a 20mm cannon. Later, they would go to 4 8mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons below them. And they would introduce an infrared targeting or beam or lamp system to try to illuminate other targets at night and shoot them down. It was a decent way to repurpose an old aircraft, but it was only of limited or dubious success. Therefore, really by 1942, these were only being used for training aircraft, a little bit of reconnaissance, a little bit of research, mostly just training though. They were also sometimes used for tugs. But really by the Middle War, even before the Battle of Kursk and the invasion of Italy, they knew that it was on the way out. And that's really one reason they produced these in the smallest number. But it was a place to go, and it was really one of Nazi Germany's first successful light bomber designs. So to revisit the 88 briefly, this one is from the Battle of Britain period, August, September, October 1940. Like I said, this is an earlier version, used more as a bomber. And this would definitely be the most produced of the ones on the table. They would build over 15,000. While she was slow to go into service and even full production, she was produced, at least in some numbers, from 1936 when the prototype flew until the end of the war. Although technically you really should say 39 to 45, but you know, hey. But they did, once they had these going, they really were cranking them out, and they found them to be quite useful. She's kind of in between, and she's actually the shortest. She's about 47 feet long, and she has a wingspan around 66 feet. Internally, she can carry 2,000 kilograms, but like the 111, she can carry external loads of more, but doing this severely impacted performance, and they often had to use rocket-assisted takeoff to even get them airborne. She too would see her crew fluctuate between 3 and 4, and she would see extra guns added over time. And she too would be used as a night fighter. In fact, there was a dedicated version, the 88G, that was made for that. This one here has the glass nose, but there were plenty of the solid nose attack versions. She was consistently the fastest at nearly 300 miles per hour. She also had the highest altitude of around 27,000 feet. Certainly the most modern, which was mostly to her advantage, but she was the most difficult of the three to fly. In fact, she earned quite a dubious reputation in the Luftwaffe. Nevertheless, even though there were attempts to supplement or replace the 88, because obviously by 1944-45 she was getting a little old, they were never successful. But again, I've done a full video on her, but it didn't seem right to bring the rest out and not talk a bit about it. But this here, the He.111, probably the most famous, although the 88's pretty famous too. The 111 is more of a medium bomber. She definitely had the most carrying capability and was a pretty versatile aircraft. Production would run until the final units were delivered in September of 1944. And including pretty much all variants, they would produce just over 6,500. So right in between the two. This had a more positive reputation with pilots. It was considered quite an easy aircraft to land, had good low altitude and relatively low speed performance, much more forgiving, much more requested, especially in 1939, 1940, than the new 88. These were used for quite a few things. There were variants that could carry torpedoes. There were reconnaissance variants with cameras, which this is actually not one of, but very similar, the H3. And there's, of course, the H-22, the V1 carrying, the Doodlebug carrying variant, which is interesting in and of itself. And when I do a dedicated video on it, I will talk about more. This is about as big as German bombers really got, at least ones that were produced in numbers to speak of, which is interesting. The payload for the 17 was relatively small, but the 88 and the 111, not absurdly small for 1930s, but whereas Britain and America continue to make bigger and bigger bombers, Germany stalled out. And the whole Schnell bomber concept kind of had the problem that it assumed it would always be the fastest thing in the sky, or at least one of them, and it wasn't. On top of that, the 111 had trouble getting the right engines, just like the 17. So if you're not going to support them, let them have what the engines they needed for best range and performance, you kind of get what you get. And it showed where priorities were, which is interesting considering Germany started off the war being the aggressor and going after Britain and later Russia. Having an adequate bomber, you would have thunk would have been a high priority. But it really wasn't. But that's what happens when you have a command-style government where people like Goering and, of course, Hitler and others can just say, make it happen, and that's what happens, even if it's not the wisest decision. But yeah, we'll definitely do a big video on this eventually, when I have some energy left. It's definitely an interesting shape. It's based on the single-engine Heinkel 70, HE70. Obviously just bigger, more capable. One thing that's kind of interesting about German bomber design in general is how the crew compartment, the cockpit, is basically one unit. I mean, it's separated by bulkheads in these to some extent, especially in the 111, but they're all concentrated together in all of these. And I said in the 88 video, they thought they had a morale advantage in having the crew able to communicate with each other. But of course, a disadvantage would be all your eggs are in one basket. Then again, if your pilot's taken out, does it really matter where your tail gunner's at? Now, the bigger problem logistically was that meant all your defensive guns were clustered near each other. And they got better as the war went on, placing them. But it still didn't give the kind of coverage like a turret would on an Allied bomber. And of course, Allied bombers, the numbers that Germany deployed in 1939, 1940 seem big, but then when you look at Allied bombing raids later in the war, they're small. And of course, Germany's ability to defend their bombers was small. They didn't really have a good long-range fighter to go with the bombers. They had the Bf-110, but yeah. And the Focke-Wulf didn't come till later. They had some good concepts, but it was definitely a half-baked notion. But, well, welcome to German logistics. But yeah, when you think about the bomb capabilities and the defensive capabilities and even the speed of these bombers compared to what the Allies were mustering by 1941, 1942, even the 88 starts to seem kind of dated. And again, this wasn't just a bomber. This was a multi-role aircraft. But the 111 really was a bomber. Secondary role of anti-shipping or reconnaissance, but yeah. And the 17, they tried using it for a few things, but its slow speed and limited duration range always came back to haunt it, even when they started putting internal fuel tanks in these and trying to increase things. And of course, as the war went on, they lost more and more pilots. 1939, 1940, they had a lot of very skilled aces, but 1943, 1944, they were losing them at an alarming rate. Now, of course, one of the last gasps of the Heinkel 111 were the Doodlebug launches. And it's quite interesting because you can consider it one of the earliest uses of a cruise missile. Germans were never for want of being at the bleeding edge of technology, that's for sure. As for the models themselves, typical Corgi, gear up or down, pilot figures inside. These pretty much all have moving guns, at least when it's considered to be a flexible mount where a moving gun would be applicable. They all have moving propellers. And they're all very heavy die-cast metal with very small amount of plastic. Sometimes some of your fins and things would be plastic. Your propellers, of course, your guns. But your fuselage, your wings, they're all metal, and they all come with metal stem stands. And as I said, mostly I like the Corgi stands. These all kind of have the style where there's a hole in the bottom and it just plugs in, which works quite well for these. But on the 111s, it's a lot of weight on that stem, and if it starts to bend, you can have problems because what goes into the plane is rubber, or at least a type of semi-flexible plastic, which is good because it won't mar up your plane. But if it starts to bend, you can have problems. Now I have repaired one with, liberal uses of glue, so it's not a lost cause. But I think a cradle style like they do for, say, their B-17s or B-24s might be more in order, at least for the 111. For the 17, the plug-in style works great because it's just not a huge aircraft. And these sit pretty good on a solid flat surface. It's only because I have them on a blanket they're a little bit wobbly. But there's pros and cons to doing them both ways. But yeah, I just thought I'd hang out with you, talk about models for a bit. I find them fun. The German stuff's not my favorite. I'm much more of a fan of the British and Japanese, and of course American and Soviet. But big iconic pieces of history, and all three of these were produced in quite noticeable numbers, so why not? With that, folks, I'm going to let you go. Any questions or comments, please do post them. And I appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon, hopefully, next time.